That's what it is. But either way, so with this that you have to experience this morning, we're going to talk about just what agroforestry is. Our next talk is going to be about cut flowers, and then the next talk before lunch is going to be about high tunnels. Y'all good with that? Okay, so if you may have seen this talk before, if you've seen me talk about agroforestry at all. So my name is Jody Thompson. I work for Kentucky State University. I'm part of a team that is predominantly natural systems management, which means how do you fix your woods to get more wildflowers and songbirds? How do you create a new woodland? How do you install or fix pollinator habitat? And how does that impact wildlife, water quality, stuff like that? That's predominantly what we do on my team. The other thing we do is some small scale ag, right? We have funding where we do agroforestry work. And what that means for us in our work is specifically alley cropping, right? But in general, agroforestry is blowing up everywhere in the States. It's much more of a thing internationally, where those practices started a long time ago to deal with steep terrain, to deal with space, also just even before it was an economic thing for some people, some cultures, you know, it's about how do you diversify your production so you have different things going on at the same time. And so there's a lot of value, both ecologically, both economically, in agroforestry practices. And so nationally, it is a huge thing right now, and Kentucky's trying to figure out, is it something that's going to work for Kentucky producers, Kentucky recreational landowners? Is it something that's going to work, be profitable, or meet your environmental health goals? Whatever those things are is what we're trying to do, right? And a lot of it is about just seeing what's going to work, seeing who's already doing things we don't know about, and seeing if we can grow something where we can all be together and just create some extra advantages for us statewide, regardless of if you're in Western Kentucky, Central Kentucky, or Eastern Kentucky. And so this talk is just what agroforestry is. That's it. We're going to talk about 5 specific practices, and we're going to spend most of our time on just a couple of them. A couple of them that make a little more sense, probably that you've already heard about, or some of you may possibly already be practicing, right? So I'm going to wander around, and I'm just going to talk. If at some point you have a question, this needs to be for you. So it doesn't matter what I've got up here or the direction I'm going. If you need to know something, just ask it. And I'll bring the mic to you. If you could just wait for the mic, and then we'll go. So, all right. So agroforestry is just an intentional incorporation of trees or shrubs, we'll just say woody plants, into some kind of other agricultural practices. So it's an integrated system. It could be livestock, it could be grains, it could be tomatoes, it could be chickens, it could be small fruit crops, it can be all kinds of things, right? Just as long as you're intentionally mixing those things together, and that thing that you're mixing in is trees or shrubs. Most people think of it as trees, the forestry part, right? But there's this place where trees and shrubs can be very similar in characteristics to what the other is. So large shrubs, small trees, for example. All right, so that's some of the stuff we mentioned, right? Why would you want to do it? Well, most of the time, some of us have some kind of extra space, right? Maybe it's some kind of marginal acreage that's not good for one type of production. Maybe it's an area that's a little steep for you to get the tractor on. Maybe you're looking at, once again, diversifying your revenue streams, which potentially could add stability to your business because you have more going on for a little bit longer period. You have different markets supporting what you're doing. Economically, that's traditionally a little bit more stable way to approach a business. By that, I don't mean you're trying to do 1,000 things, but maybe you're just trying to do a few things, take advantage of points of sale at different, like farmers markets, other types of vendors, or you're selling wholesale off your farm, right? You want to have a few different things going on, right? So a lot of people these days too have more interest in looking at more of a holistic approach, right? Protecting your riparian habitat, which improves your water quality. Maybe you do care about wildlife. Maybe you're a part-time farmer, which a lot of folks are, right? And so those recreational interests are just as important or almost as important as your economic interests, meaning the farming side of things. I don't think it's a stretch to say most people care about pollinators, right? So some of these things, these benefits to this is also being able to look at increasing the use of native flowering plants on your farm. Because usually, I think it's pretty well understood that if you create a little extra pollinator habitat, that might provide you a little bit of bump in your squash or your pepper yield or something like that, right? That's the kind of thing that we've heard of before, right? Or maybe you're already practicing. All right. So let's skip through some of this. Let's just talk first about the practices themselves, right? And we'll talk about the details about why they matter, those other slides, as we go through it. Alley cropping, silvopasture, forest farming, riparian habitat, windbreaks, these are what we call the big five, right? From a production standpoint, mostly we're looking at alley cropping, silvopasture, and forest farming. We throw things in like riparian habitat, largely because we want folks to promote, keeping your stream banks from washing away, or contributing to what we call like an unstable, like stream system. Like usually if you have a lot of flashy flooding, degrading stream banks, your fields are washing away at your farm, it's usually a product of what's going on upstream. And that's really hard to deal with because you can't fix your neighbor's property. You're mostly just dealing with yours. That and stream bank, stream improvement, anything like that is extremely expensive. In the ecological restoration world, it's usually our highest practice costs because earth moving costs a lot of money, right? For that reason alone. So anytime we can protect those for whatever your values are, we want to try to do that. Windbreaks should be a no-brainer, right? That can reduce pesticide drift. It can reduce burning your crops simply from the high winds blowing over things. It can keep dust out of your field. And then when herbicides volatilize, right, like goes from something that's on the ground gets back up into the air because it gets too hot, it can slow a little bit of that stuff down too, right? But these areas that we might use windbreaks and riparian buffers, we're not often farming those areas or right up next to them. So there's a place in there sometimes that's extra acres that are safe for you to produce things like fruit or nut trees or something like that. Okay, alley cropping. What does this mean? So we see the rows of trees, and then they're farming in between them. But they're also farming the rows of trees, right? These trees could be for firewood, they could be for timber, these trees can be nut trees, right? They're not usually gonna be just wildlife trees, right? If we move a little farther west, we're gonna see things like more pecans. These could be persimmons, which grow just fine around here, but they don't have to be trees. They could be shrubs, like we grow elderberries now, right? Some folks successfully grow hazelnuts, right? But then there's all kinds of other choices. So it doesn't have to be the big tall ones. But you see this person is probably growing corn. You can also grow forage for your cattle. You can grow vegetable crops in here. And the way you lay these out is simply a matter of spacing. Because in all cases we're talking about, all of these crops need sunlight, right? But all crops don't necessarily need the blazing sun all day long every day. In fact, we see reduced yield when those crops get too hot. And so sometimes, like strawberries, for example, right? If you provide a period during the day, during most days during the growing season, where you just reduce a little bit of that heat, you usually see extra yield. So that is an example. All right, so it's really about the combinations. And the reason we start with alley cropping, talking about that, is mostly because alley cropping is just farming. You're just farming plants. It's like this mix of row crop farming and orchard management together. And that's stuff that people already know how to do. So we like to start with this one. Our experiment at our West Farm that we bought, KSU's West Farm that we bought last year, it's focused on elderberries. Like, does growing elderberries next to peppers or squash provide some kind of advantage? So far, well, even only halfway through the growing season on that experiment, we're thinking that we see differences in the plant health in both those squash and those peppers. Not sure what it is yet. We're thinking that because the elderberries were in the ground one season longer, that they're probably improving soil health because those roots grow really fast and they spread well, right? Which provides lots of advantages for organic matter, largely probably because of water, at least at this point in time. But they could also be windbreaks. And so once again, high winds can burn your crop leaves, which just means they run the water out of the leaves really quickly. That's what that burn is, when they start to brown and dry out, if it's not a pathogen, that is. Yeah, and maybe a little bit of heat reduction. We should know by next year what the actual advantages are, but we think we are clearly seeing some stuff. But anyway, there's all kinds of combinations of alley cropping, so you can find something that's suitable for your property just because of all the potential things you could be doing. And I think I'd mentioned this, width of the rows is dependent. If you're growing walnuts, if you're trying to grow grains between walnuts, you're probably going to want your spacing between trees to be at least 50 to 60 feet. But let's say that you're only running chickens through your elderberries or whatever, your spacing can be really tight, so you can cram those in a little bit more. So it's always dependent. And something too that you're probably going to realize as we go through this, every practice and every combination is not appropriate for everybody. It really depends on your specific goals, right? But if you're not doing it, it's kind of an experiment, kind of figuring out what you need. And we want to be there to help you with that. And the reason that you put trees and shrubs on the ground too is if you have long-term, years long goals of production. So this is an example of corn between walnuts. These walnuts are probably, I'm going to guess they're less than 10 years old. Corn, obviously, is grown like an annual. This spacing is not going to work forever. Clearly, the walnuts are going to shade the corn out, right? But your goals may not be to keep corn forever, or soybeans work in these kinds of situations, and grains and stuff. Like other vegetable crops certainly will, but this goal is probably for the walnuts, right? It's probably for nut production in this specific sense. And so at some point they know that they're not going to be growing anything under them, right? So you may be able to get a few years out of something, but this is the situation that works for them, right? But in some cases, you may want that integrated production to last forever. So you would create your spacing to affect that. All right, silvopasture, the next one. What does that mean? That means you're just grazing animals under and around trees. Why might you want to do this? With cows specifically. Why might you want trees? Some of you already know the answer to this, I know, right? But let's get some little bit of interaction going. Why would you want trees in your cattle operation? Shade, heat stress, right? It's not going to put on weight. If you're in the dairy business, which is not my thing, right? You're just not going to have the product that you need. But that cow physiologically won't produce as well. It won't do what it needs to because it gets too hot. The exact same reasons that heat affects you, the exact same reasons heat affects plants. It's the same thing, right? So you need some kind of shade. So here we see different examples of stuff. We see different age groups of trees, right? Over here we see in this upper left, we see rows of trees. There's probably something intentional going on with those rows of trees. Right? Maybe they're going to cut them before they get too old. Maybe they are nut trees. It could be any number of things. And then we get over here, it could be a similar thing, right? But at the same time, sometimes trees are on the ground just to provide the shade resource, and that's it. Somebody asked me the other day, hey, I want to grow black locust firewood, and I want to run my cows through them. The first thing he asked me was, are there NRCS programs that help with me on the firewood side? I said, I don't think so. And he said, well, and he's going to run his cows through, so that'd be an extra benefit. I said, wait, slow down. That's a whole different thing. right? You have these two intentional products together. NRCS does want to get into agroforestry in their practices. I don't know if they have established practices. I wish I did for this talk, right? But that is a goal nationally that you might be able to get some funds for, or soon you may be able to get some funds for agroforestry practices. So, but the goal with locusts, as you know, they resprout, they grow relatively fast, right? And they are very tolerant of cows walking over their roots, right? So that one makes a lot of sense. Here's an example of different types of silvopasture. On the right, we have hybrid poplars. So they're going to grow these trees just to make pellets out of, probably. You cut these down, you turn them into a product, into like a compressed product that might be used on very small scale in heaters, but also in power plants, or just lots of different reasons, right? That's why you would use wood for that kind of fuel, but they're just running their chickens through them, right? That is silvopasture. In the middle, this is probably somewhere in the southeast, because we see pine trees and we see cows grazing under the pine trees. This is very common in Florida, it's common in Virginia, right? We're not really a pine state, but the reason this works is because there's enough sunlight that gets to the ground that you can plant a different forage mix where some of those species are a little bit more tolerant of shade. And if as long as you're managing the spacing of your trees, then you'll be able to continue to have forage. This is not going to keep these cows all year, right? They're rotating them through there, and it's just one of their resources on their farm. Same reason that we would use cool season grasses, and then in another part of your rotation, you may use like perennial native warm seasons, right? They're doing different things at different times. But those pine trees are going to get cut down eventually. They're going to be turned into pulp. That kind of spacing, they're probably not going to be turned, they may or may not be turned into timber, it just depends. And then over here on the left, I'm not 100% what I'm seeing there, but it's clearly a pasture. I don't know what they're doing with those trees, but if we can imagine those are pecans. As you move a little farther west, close to the Mississippi River, you go a little farther south, where I grew up, where pecan trees are in everybody's backyard, right? They're often harvesting those pecans also. The market's not what it used to be, I don't think, but I'm also not a pecan expert. I may just be talking out of my tail, not know what I'm talking about. All right, so it's usually a combination of both things. Benefits to your cows are extra places to graze, extra resources, heat reduction, and then you're doing something with the wood also, right? Yeah. All right, we're going to skim over this one, and I'm not keeping up with my own time. So I am talking till 10. All right, we got a lot of time. Once again, I apologize if this is the first thing you're seeing this morning. So, all right, am I boring you to tears yet? Does anybody have questions at all about silvopasture? I'll fumble my way through it, I promise. And does this have anything related to CPS? I'm not familiar with CPS. Oh, CSP practices. Right, so CSP practices are usually practices that you will implement on your farm if you're already doing conservation. Yes, sir. It could. Yeah, I think we can arrange practices and payments so that it could. What NRCS is going to want to see with what we've been talking about is if they have specific agroforestry practices that they'll pay for.
They inspect the woods and everything. They look at it before they give you.
Oh, yeah. So the question is, will they come out and inspect it and look at it? So the way it works is you go under contract with NRCS within their specific programs. After you're under contract, you implement a practice of some sort. Like maybe it is tree planting. That's one of our practices. Maybe it is conservation cover. That means you're planting native warm season grasses and pollinator habitat. After you have implemented a practice, then they come out and they look at it and they say, that meets our standards, and then they deposit your payment that you were under contract for into your account. Is that what you're, yes, sir. But the silvopasture practices specifically, or agroforestry practices, I need to check on that. So, yes, sir. Okay, so it's just talk right now then.
It is talk, and that was one of my
Okay, yeah.
is that are you going to show this data to NRC?
Okay.
So I have farmers that NRCS is very hesitant about approving you could talk to them, say, hey,
Oh, yeah.
we're okay to do on
Mhm.
have pasture, they don't necessarily want to plant trees in pasture. Forested area. They want to push invasives.
Right.
They want to get their goats and there to get rid of them.
Mm-hmm.
And running into
Yeah.
These farmers that has 4 or 5 acres. These farmers that have 4 or 5 acres, right, that want to push their cows or goats or whatever in there, will they pay you to do that?
There's no NRCS programs. However, there are climate smart programs that are within the state of Kentucky. They're called climate smart programs. So, for example, there's some through Oak. The one that I'm working on is called Building Soils, Building Equity. So we are promoting agroforestry practices, silvopasture. So you would apply for that, and they're paying, a certain amount of money per acreage for these practices. The problem is that since I'm writing the plans in Kentucky, is that NRCS says we don't like what you're doing. So I'm coming up with a map and saying a conservation plan using this silvopasture, and NRCS is pushing back and said, we don't like that. We need very specific details about how you're going to push the cows up into the forest or forest farming. The forest farming, most of my producers want to plant ginseng, black cohosh. These are things that are minimally invasive. But since NRCS has not contracted with the state's historical cultural resources, so there are people that come out and look at your farm, make sure you don't have Indian mounds or cemeteries or whatnot before we actually break ground. But these are things that we're not actually driving tractors or taking trees down. We might thin trees with a forestry plan to thin the trees so we can put our natives back in there again. They will clean it up. They don't want cows on a slope, because now we're getting back to the water quality, because cows on a slope, we all know how cows travel. They could travel across the slope in a single line, and they make these ruts, which causes erosion. I mean, we want small ruminants up into good, on a slope, like, greater than 10% slope. We don't want a big old cow up there. We can push the cows up in there for a little bit, but it's not permanent pasture. Like, they go up there, they graze for it maybe in August and come back out of there, because they're pretty destructive. Small ruminants are different. They're not near as destructive on that landscape.
Grab your question real quick, or your comment.
I'm retired NRCS
There we go.
for about 45 years.
Yes, sir.
That lady there is one of the people that we work with.
Yes.
I think she writes the plans. But we have specific guidelines.
Yes.
And we work with people. If it's a lot of forestry to be done, we have to work with the forestry department. But we, as NRCS, have our engineers, we have our soil scientists, we have our soil conservationists, we have guidelines for the slopes that we work with, where to put certain crops, depending on the slope. And you got to give respect to those slopes due to the fact you don't want the water washing into the creek. And of course, you have a certain amount of animals, cows especially, per acre. Not a lot of grass is going to grow out underneath a tree. And sometimes them water trees will poison other trees. Mm-hmm. So we have specific guidelines to go by. And usually, NRCS will help you with those things. They will come out and look at what you're wanting and see if we have programs, whether it be equipped, state, or local cost share, to accommodate you. And once you sign up for it, and if you go by their plans and specifications and complete it according to those plans and specifications, then you're given some cost share money to encourage you to keep going.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for that. And feel free to chime in too, especially on the technical aspects of what I'm fumbling my way through. So most of my EQIP experience is based on like natural areas conservation practices. Yes, sir.
Okay, everybody's talking about cattle. I know a lot of people in other states are using goats, and they're not so eruptive to the soil, and they'll clear anything from 6 foot down, and they don't usually eat the grass because they like the briars and that kind of stuff, which is a pain in the butt for us. Normally, a goat doesn't eat grass. They eat brush, thistle stuff. So that's a way to clean up your woods and have it inhabitable for your wildlife, your deer that eats the grass.
Don't get boar goats. Yeah.
He-goats can have 4 times as many parasites as a boar can and still be healthy. And boars are made for a desert climate. This is a water rainforest that we live in, whether we like it or not. We took away the forest, but it's still a rainforest. And the mold and stuff gets in their hooves. It's a constant fight. He-goats right now, they have 2% less meat than a boar does, but if you take the he-goat size of their head compared to the size of the head of the boar, you're still getting more meat. So he-goat is the thing for Kentucky.
We had an experiment too that we just finished up recently in Louisville where we put goats on some early successional habitat, and we have the data supports kind of what we already knew, but if anybody wants to talk to me about details about that afterwards, I'm glad to do that.
What kind of goats did he say they were?
Can you repeat your comments on the goats?
What's that?
She said, what goats did you say they were? You'd mentioned a couple of things about parasite loads and things like that.
Boars are known for their parasites. Okay, there's 32 different parasites in the state of Kentucky that will kill a boar goat. Okay? They are not normally in a rainforest environment. They're for a desert environment. Texas is a great place for boars. It's not for, when they brought boars into Kentucky, that was an idiotic situation because they don't live here. They are pretty, but they are not adaptable to our climate. Pico's is about the best one that I know of. Put a brush goat out there, but they won't.
There is some goat programs too that go on here during our third Thursday, at least 1 month out of the year. If anybody has, I haven't attended this one myself, but they do have these, and they do have a goat herd here that they rotate and they use for things like a little bit of demonstration brush management as well as just general production. Let me know if anybody wants more. And it sounds like there's a lot of experience in the room already, right? So if you are available to carry on that afterwards, I think folks probably would be appreciative. One more comment on the practices in RCS, and what was your name in the back with NCAT, right? Tammy is working on, there's a grant that she's talking about, a federal grant that is separate from NRCS cost share practices, right? It's a separate thing, but are you okay with them coming to see you after if they're interested? Cool, all right. So the last thing we want to mention in this, I think we're going to blow past windbreaks if y'all are okay with that, riparian I mean, and probably something that you a little bit more familiar with. I'm not the expert on this. I get asked lots of questions. Once again, I fumble my way through it. But when folks think about agroforestry in this part of the world, this is where they go to first. Ginseng, black cohosh, just different things like that, ramps, right? Then these are all native plants, native to a broad range, but they grow really well in the climates and the soil conditions of the Appalachians. So there's different ways that you could do, I don't remember if there was, yeah. So here what we're seeing is just there's the edge of a woodland or there's an old stand of something. And this is pretty intensely cultivated. And folks will do this. They'll do this with ginseng. They'll do it with these other what we call forest botanicals. There's strong markets for this, especially internationally. In fact, Kentucky is, or at least was at one time, probably the biggest producer of ginseng of the U.S. states for East Asian markets. Ginseng, though, is a federally protected plant. Luckily, the Kentucky Department of Ag is very interested in loosening some of the cultivation, seed growing, plant growing, and selling regulations. I don't know if that's going to go anywhere, but that is a thing right now that's going on in Kentucky Department of Ag to loosen some of those regulations. But essentially, all it is you're doing some kind of farming within a wooded situation. What we're often used to is some kind of wild cultivated or wild collected system where you're not manipulating things very intensively. But when we're about to step into the world, KSU is about to step into the world of doing some intensive cultivation and production practices of some of these things in Eastern Kentucky in partnership with folks like Appalachian Sustainable Development, which is based out of Virginia, and Grow Appalachia, and some of our partners who are very interested in folks in Eastern Kentucky. It's not restricted to Eastern Kentucky, though. Ginseng grows all over the place, right? Ginseng grows in Hodgenville. Ginseng grows in, Warren County, et cetera, right? We're going to start on Eastern Kentucky, though, because that's where it grows the best, right? And that's where folks have this really strong cultural knowledge of efficient practices. So, but that's what forest farming is. Does that mean you can't farm some of these things in a woodlot in your backyard? You can do that too, right? Now, production practices for these plants. I'd say the knowledge is not very robust, meaning that in that context, it means there's for many of the people who are producing these plants, their knowledge of how to produce them at scale isn't usually there. But that's also not a common practice in the southern Appalachians, right? Meaning cultivating and growing in rows or growing under shade in the woods, right? What I mean by cultivation. But this was just to give you an overview of what agroforestry is. And what I think is that many people in this room and other rooms are already doing agroforestry. You're just not calling it that. But there's a lot of advantages that it provides. There's a lot of potential for it to help folks out, probably more so on smaller scales, right? But that's where most people are too, are on smaller scales. But if you have parts of your property you're not using, or that maybe you're interested in leasing out to somebody else, this might be something at least to consider. There's lots of room for orchards. There's lots of room for integrated fruit production from trees or shrubs. Some of these things that we've talked about maybe amending your wooded edge so that it is a little bit more appropriate to run your cows or your goats through, right? Taking advantage of the space you have without breaking the space you have. That's really the message. And those are things that we can do. And this is the end of the slideshow. Well, that's me if you want to get a hold of me. There's a lot of things I don't know how to do. I know how to talk a lot very clearly, right? But I know how to point you in the direction of other folks who work a whole lot harder than I do, so they're better at what they do. So if you have specific questions, send them to me anyway, and I can put you in contact with the other groups in the state and surrounding states that are doing these things that we're trying to grow into, and I can guarantee you they are going to try to help you out, even if it's just a conversation or pointing you towards appropriate like EQIP practices or other practices that we've talked about. And if you wouldn't mind taking that survey, we would be very appreciative so that they can help continuing improving these types of meetings and giving you what you need. And I'm going to leave you with this unless you'll have specific questions. In cooperative extension, part of my appointment is cooperative extension. The other part's research, right? All of us that work in cooperative extension take requests, right? If you have something, a program coming out to your property, like there's a lot of folks who do that work really well. But there's a lot of people who do not realize that you've already paid for our service because you pay taxes. So there is no bother. It's just, I need your help, or can we have a conversation? And our job is to do that for you. Spread that word around too. So that's cooperative extension's purpose. All right, we got a few minutes. Anybody have any questions or anybody need to address anything to anybody else in the room? You're over this, right? I'm overhearing me talk too. It's okay. Yeah. Sycamores, like, so how do I feel about sycamores on the creek in what context?
Okay, I got a semi-load of sand in my garden. I like sandy soil.
Yep.
And I had a bunch of sycamores coming up in it, and I'm not wasteful, so I pulled them up and put them in little pots. and I got to plant them, so I was thinking about putting them on our creek's bed. I don't know.
Is that going to work? Is that what you're asking?
Well, yeah, I don't want to plant anything invasive.
Oh, yeah.
Anything invasive.
Well, so the first question I have for you is this a very steep situation, or is it flat? Is your bank edge, that riparian area, is it flat? Does it flood very often there? Okay, yeah. So sycamores are typically supposed to be there, right? They do very well in moist, right? Yeah, so sometimes we see like a shoal, a sandy bank, a gravel bank, just covered in these things, right? But sycamores are not invasive. They're very easy to control. And what you're going to see is when any of those get up to a certain size, they're going to start competing with each other enough they'll thin themselves out. It's a tree, so it's kind of a years-long process, right? The invasive issues is a little bit different, right? Invasives are plants that it's very difficult to control. They're not native to here, and they are breaking things. They're preventing other things from growing. They're doing, now, sometimes we may think things like poison ivy or stuff like that is invasive, right? Poison ivy is actually supposed to be there, right? And it's not that big of a deal to control. Anything you can do to get woody plants and a root system in soil that doesn't have woody plants in it is going to be an advantage. Now, in areas that are prone to flooding, so high energy water movement across the landscape, like intense, what we call sheet flow, right? It can be difficult to establish plants because those floodwaters will blow them out. So that one's difficult to do, but there are techniques that can help that. But sycamores establish well. They're supposed to be there. They grow fast. It's better than not having things there. But I will state this too. Every situation's a little different. So if you can work with somebody, like I don't mind like coming out and taking a look, and there's other people who are at least as good at this and better than I am, yeah, just call. I think we've been talking anyway. Yeah. So yeah, that's the answer to that question. Yes.
Trees for bees, examples of species.
Examples of species that are good for bees. Trees specifically. So the ones that we like to hear about most are things like maples, willows, basswoods, locusts of any sort, right? Those all also happen to be things that are some of our earliest bloomers, and so they're extremely important to have resources, those pollen and nectar resources, predominantly pollen resources for bees, very early in the season. And then there's a whole suite of things, including shrubs and other flowering plants, which we can get a list of things too. It'll be easier for me to put a list together than think of it on the fly. But elderberries, outstanding plant for bees because they flower in the middle of summer or earlier in the summer. So there's a slew of things like that, but some of those early season resources are extremely important for all kinds of bees. Like the red buds, yep, red buds. Bees will be all over red buds, right? And all of these things I've mentioned are native, but there's lots of other choices too. Any other questions before we wrap this up? All right, yes, one more. Can you repeat that one more time?
Elderberries, do they spread all over or are they easy to contain?
Elderberries are easy to contain. They do spread, right? That's one of the advantages. They do spread, but what'd you say? Yeah. So elderberries grow best in moist soils, ditches, wetland edges. We use them in wetland restoration, stream bank restoration. There's a lot of cultivated, improved varieties also and selections. If you're growing them for production, though, you're not typically growing them in those wetter situations so that you can manage them like an orchard, right? Sandier, looser soils. So it's kind of like just if these places that are loose, well drained, a little bit of organic, just decent soils, but they're pretty tolerant. But if you're growing for production, for yield, you are going to want to tailor your site a little bit more for that. If it's just something you want to take a little bit of advantage of, there's no reason to just use what's already on your property and harvest off of those. But there are specific production methods that can improve how you use elderberries, like cutting them back every year so you have more even growth, right? And spacing things out, and also cultivating them in situations that you can walk or drive like a gator through or something like that. So less wet situations. Their roots do spread 100%. They're gonna pop up feet off of your rows, right? But that's kind of part of your maintenance practices. If you're mowing between rows or you're maintaining those, you're not typically going to have as big of a problem out of them. So it's kind of an issue of like how intensive and well managed do you want your production to be? But yeah. We're going to need to wrap this up. I need to see if our next speaker is here. And the next thing that is on the schedule is cut flowers. Let me check on that super quick and see what we